con los candidatos a gobernador para la boleta demócrata en las primarias demócratas del 8 de junio. Este es un evento organizado por los 3 caucuses de minorías electorales, como somos el caucus afroamericano, el latino y el asiático. Bienvenidos. Vamos a estar haciendo traducción simultánea por el chat y luego habrá se va a transcribir todo el evento a español.
Thank you so much, Carla, for opening that up for our Spanish speakers out there. Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining the Tri-Caucus Governor Forum hosted by the Democratic Black Caucus of Virginia, the Democratic Latino Organization of Virginia, and the Democratic Asian Americans Caucus of Virginia. I am E.J. Scott, and I'm the chair of the Democratic Black Caucus. To begin our evening, all candidates seeking the Democratic nomination for governor were invited to participate in this forum. I'd like to thank all of the candidates who made the time in their busy schedules to be with us tonight. And I'd like to thank the audience for attending tonight, because on June 8th, one of these candidates will be elected to be our Democratic candidate for the governor of Virginia. You can choose, as Carla said, to listen in Spanish or English, and we are streaming on our Facebook pages. I really would like to thank the Latino Caucus and the Asian Caucus for agreeing to be part of this historic forum. You know, this is the first time that all three of Virginia's caucuses of color have joined together to put together a candidate forum. And, you know, this forum offers the opportunity for candidates to speak directly to our Tri-Caucus communities, which represents almost 40% of the communities, of the population in Virginia. These forums allow our communities access to asking questions that are important to us. So I'd like to thank Jonathan Drumgold, president of the Latino Caucus, and his incredible team. And I'd like to thank Privan Mayan and his team at the Asian Caucus. And of course, my Black Caucus forum team, Sandra Antoine and Nicole Houston, for making these forums possible. Now, I'm really excited to introduce our moderator tonight. Atima Omara is founder and chief strategist for the Amaro Strategy Group, which consults to progressive candidates and organizations centering women and people of color in their work. Over the last 17 years, Atima has worked for a Virginia governor and staff on multiple Democratic candidates' campaigns all across Virginia and all across the country. She is the former president of the Young Democrats of America, and she has served on boards all in our area, all across DC, Virginia, and Maryland. Atima currently serves on the Democratic Party of Virginia's Central and Steering Committee and is in her second term representing Virginia to the Democratic National Committee. She also writes on political and multiple publications and provides political commentary to MSNBC and PBS. So thank you, Atima, for agreeing to moderate today. Over to you.
Thank you, EJ, for kicking things off. Again, as I mentioned, my name is Atima Omara, and I am your moderator for this evening's Tri-Caucus Governor Candidate Forum tonight. So before starting, I just want to briefly explain the format of this forum. We have a series of questions for our candidates, and we'll be fielding questions from our audience. The candidates did not receive any of these questions in advance. If you need me to repeat any question, please let me know. We will also be putting them in the chat. We also have our fabulous moderator translating in Spanish in the chat for those who need it as well. And if the audience has a question you'd like to submit, please use the Q&A feature on the Zoom webinar. In order to get through as many questions as possible, including audience questions, candidates will have 90 seconds to answer each question. Shouldn't be a problem with this professional crowd here. And after that time is up, we will notify the candidate and switch to the next candidate or question. The order of who answers each question will be selected at random, and we'll give you notice of who is to go and in what order. So want to thank those candidates who are here with us today. State Senator Jennifer McClellan, former Delegate Jennifer Carroll Foy, and Delegate Lee Carter. Thank you for joining us. So we'll get started with our first question. As governor, what will you do to amend a criminal justice system that disproportionately targets Blacks and other communities of color? And I will start with Senator Jennifer McClellan.
Well, thank you, Atima, and to the caucuses for hosting tonight's forum. I announced my complete justice reform plan yesterday, and you can find the full details on my website at jennifermcclellan.com. But I'll break it down into a few very quick pieces. First, we need to continue to eliminate low-level offenses that criminalize poverty, mental illness, and substance addiction. I've done a lot of this work with ending the disorderly conduct for students at school and school-sponsored events, leading the charge to make sure marijuana simple possession was legalized by July 1st of this year. We need to make sure that when someone is arrested, that their access to justice does not depend on the lawyer they can afford. So continuing to make sure all evidence related to their crime, particularly if mental health conditions are affected, can be introduced, making sure that we equalize pay for public defenders and Commonwealth's attorney, expand public defenders in more jurisdictions, that when someone is convicted, that the punishment is proportionate to the crime, ending mandatory minimum sentences, that when they are incarcerated on day one, we are focused on rehabilitation and reentry and not waiting until 60 days before they are released, that we bring back discretionary parole, that once someone, that we focus on the services while they are incarcerated they need, whether it's substance abuse, workforce training, we make sure we give them that. And once they are released, that we are restoring their rights automatically and that we are expunging their records as quickly as possible automatically and helping them get back reintegrated into society. And all the details of that plan you can find on my website at jennifermcclellan.com.
Awesome, thank you. Slightly over, but I wanted to let you finish that sentence. All right, next, Delegate Carol Foy.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Tri-Caucus. Thank you, Atima. Thank you, EJ, for having me and moderating and hosting. I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to say that as the first public defender ever elected to the Virginia General Assembly, there was a resounding, singular, monolithic voice that was down in Richmond. It was mainly prosecutors or legislators who have no real experience interacting with our draconian criminal justice system, understanding the relics of Jim Crow that we have on the books here in the Commonwealth that's single-handedly contributed to mass incarceration. So I can tell you that since day one, I've been fighting this issue from the courthouse to the state house. And so making sure that we have more representation on the bench throughout Virginia with my Diversify the Bench efforts, working with many of the legislators in Prince William County to put the first Hispanic on the bench in Prince William County, where we have almost a 20% Hispanic population, the first in Arlington County as well, the first Black woman in Loudoun County. So representation matters, and we have to ensure that we have advocates who's doing that. I've carried the legislation to legalize marijuana for several years, and I'm happy that we were able to get it passed, but there's still more work to do to ensure those social equity programs are in place to uplift the communities that have been most hurt and harmed by disinvestments, mass incarceration, the war on drugs, and over-policing. So I will ensure those investments are made in Black and Brown communities to have more day centers and childcare centers, to invest in community service boards, millions of more dollars to at-risk school add-ons for high schools with or schools with high free and reduced lunch. That is exceptionally important. And I can tell you, I will address and decriminalize poverty in Virginia. I help lead the fight to remove,
final sentence, just want to
remove the practice of driving while poor, and I'll do more as governor.
Thank you. And Delegate Lee Carter.
Thank you so much. So I think a lot of people don't realize that the United States incarcerates more of its people than any other country in history. To put a little bit of perspective on the scale of the incarceration problem that we have here in the US, our incarceration rate is roughly 10 times that of Japan. And the overwhelming majority of those folks are locked up in state courts, not federal. So state governments, and particularly governors, have a tremendous ability and authority to end that practice immediately. And as governor, I will fight to immediately end the practice of mass incarceration and begin to move Virginia in the direction of justice, of reintegrating folks into their communities. And the fundamental thing that we have to stop doing is relying upon long sentences to think that we could possibly incarcerate our way into safe communities. It hasn't worked for nearly 40 or 50 years. It will never work. It was always doomed to fail. So as governor, I will fight to reduce Virginia's prison population by working with the General Assembly to decriminalize possession of all drugs and continue the process of legalization of cannabis. I will fight to decriminalize sex work. I will fight to remove as many misdemeanor offenses as we possibly can from the code, defelonize as many current felonies as we can from the code, and bring our prison population down. But I can promise you this, even if the General Assembly does not work with me on these issues, I will use all the powers of the governor's office to directly reduce mass incarceration in the Commonwealth of Virginia. As governor, I will ensure that our prison population goes down by at least 30% over my 4 years, even if I have to sign thousands of clemency and pardon petitions myself.
Thank you, Delegate Carter. Next question. Virginia is one of the country's wealthiest states and spends millions of dollars with companies throughout the state. Yet Black-owned businesses have historically received less than 1% of the Commonwealth's business. As governor, what will you do to right this long-standing disparity among Black and other communities of color who have businesses? And I will start with Delegate Carol Floyd.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I can tell you, I had a conversation with Mark, who owned Eats restaurant in Bristol, Virginia, and he communicated these exact same issues, that the problem is that there's not enough money to go around, or that Black-owned businesses are not being provided the information in order to keep their doors open and to open the ones that have been closed due to COVID. So as governor, I will ensure to implement as an initiative to have 45% of all of our discretionary spending for goods and services spent with small women and minority-owned businesses here in Virginia. I will put $10 million a year towards my Rebuild Virginia Small Business Grant that we will allow businesses, especially targeting Black and Brown businesses and AAPI businesses and Latinx businesses, to be able to draw those funds and be able to effectively communicate that these funds and this assistance is available by making sure we have everything in multiple different languages. We're communicating with the faith communities as well, so we can dispatch your information in an efficient, effective way and continue to uplift businesses here in Virginia. And so that's my promise as governor.
Thank you. Senator McCollum.
First, I apologize for my daughter trying to Zoom bomb us. Before COVID, access to capital was one of the largest impediments to SWAN businesses. And so I helped to create in the 2021 budget a community development fund to help invest in our SWAN businesses through low interest loans, grants, and forgivable loans. And I will increase the investment in that as governor. I will make sure that we have a COVID effects small business loan program to specifically address the impacts of COVID on those SWAM businesses such as brick and mortar retail, restaurants, childcare providers that have been the most devastated by COVID and need the most state effort to get back on their feet. I will make sure we pass and implement a SWAM procurement bill that we tried to get passed in this General Assembly session, but the Senate Republicans blocked it using a procedural move. I will make sure that it is implemented. I'll make sure that our SWAM businesses are able to provide the minimum wage through the grant program to help them manage trends that were already coming that they don't have time to plan for anymore. Finally, I'll make sure that we implement the state healthcare exchange, which will allow small businesses to purchase plans through the exchange. And we also have to redefine small businesses to include those that are owned by LGBTQ plus individuals, and make sure that the definitions are different for different industries, because different industries, what is small for a brick and mortar retail may not be small for a technology company. So these are part of my focus as governor.
Thank you, Senator McCollum. And Delegate Carter.
One of the central themes of my campaign has been overhauling our economic development system, because I think there is some fairly broad agreement out there that it is fundamentally broken. And this is just one aspect of how it is broken. We have seen that our economic development system prioritizes the needs of big business and tries to rely on massive corporations coming in from out of state to pretty please give us some jobs. And that approach has failed for many, many years. So as governor, I will fight to overhaul our economic development system so that we're no longer giving massive handouts to multinational corporations that are owned by people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. And that money instead stays here at home in Virginia. And we use that money as the startup capital necessary for folks to start their own employee-owned enterprises within their own communities. So these businesses, instead of being owned and operated by outside investors, are owned and operated by working Virginians for working Virginians. They can become pillars of the community. And that way, when the next economic crisis hits, and we do have one every 5 to 7 years, when the next economic crisis hits, decisions about our communities are not being made by faraway millionaire and billionaire investors. Those decisions that impact the people who go to work every day in these communities and who live in these communities should be made by the folks in those communities. And the only way to do that is to guarantee that the businesses that are making those decisions are owned and operated by the people who live there and work there. And absolutely, I just want to reiterate something that Senator McClellan said. We have to overhaul our SWAM certification system, because there are far too many loopholes. There are far too many ways where the definitions are too imprecise, and it allows larger businesses that really should not qualify to take advantage of the efforts that we're putting out there to help diversify our public procurement suppliers.
Thank you, Delegate Carter. All right, next question is: the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the inequities across our Commonwealth. From broadband access to healthcare access, we have seen just how community colors have been impacted. How will you as governor rebuild faith in our Commonwealth's infrastructure, knowing that communities of color are disproportionately affected? And I will start with you, Delegate Carter, this time.
Well, for starters, on broadband, we have got to get out of the model of trying to subsidize the private telecoms to bring broadband to every residential address. It's a model that's not working, and it's a model that failed us with electricity as well in the early part of the 20th century. We saw where the government tried to incentivize private electricity providers nearly 100 years ago to expand their service to every address. And it didn't work until eventually, as part of the New Deal, the government just hired public employees to run the wires and then spin that infrastructure off to the rural electric cooperatives and municipal utilities that we still have today. We have to use that same approach on broadband. But when it comes to the infrastructural needs of communities of color in particular, I think we have to look at schools as one of the biggest priorities there. We have seen that far too many communities in Virginia have schools that are crumbling, while other wealthier communities in Virginia, they get to choose from choice private schools or the absolute best funded public schools in the Commonwealth. And that dichotomy is not fair. So we must make sure that with all of this infrastructure money that's coming into Virginia as part of the federal recovery plan, we have to prioritize rebuilding of our schools, because absolutely no student anywhere in Virginia should have to go to school in a building that is crumbling down around them.
Thank you, Delegate Carter. Delegate Carol Foy.
Yeah, so I'm excited about this question because I can tell you making investments in infrastructure is the most efficient and effective way that we are going to pull up ourselves out of this economic recession or depression, whatever you want to term it. And so I can tell you that having a bond that's created that has $1 billion that schools can draw from in order to modernize their classrooms, add on classrooms to existing schools where there's high student to teacher ratios, being able to put new roofs on the buildings, that's going to equate to jobs here in Virginia. It's going to help our schools, especially our schools in majority minority communities, in rural communities who are desperate need of those funds, because some of our schools were built 50, 60, 100 years ago. Expanding broadband to 97% of all Virginians is going to help unlock the possibility and potential to address some of the inequities in our healthcare system, because transportation is a barrier for many people of color. However, once you have telemedicine and telehealth, or once we have mobile health clinics, then people can get connected to preventative care and connected to their medications and the help that they need, which is so important. We can have mass virtual learning. People can telework no matter where they are. These are the things that's extremely important that I'm excited to get done. And when we talk about quality of life, especially for many people of color, women, especially making up the majority of retail, hospitality, a lot of these industries where we can't afford to live where we work, then having the light rail and making sure those investments are executed, that we make the investments in Hampton Roads Bridge Tunnel, that we expand I-81 and make good on all the promises that we made to shore up our bridges and roads and to decrease the amount of time people are spending in traffic every single day is a top priority as well. So all of these things are intersectional: environmental justice, healthcare justice, educational justice. And as governor, I'll make sure to root out all the inequities in our systems that's leaving far too many communities behind.
Thank you. Senator McCullen.
Well, first we need to broaden how we define infrastructure. Broadband, transportation, school buildings, infrastructure, pipeways, combined sewer overflow systems. These are all infrastructure that we traditionally think about that we need to invest in. And as governor, I will invest in everything from making sure that we map where the and underserved areas are for broadband, because we don't even have that. We're working on that at the state level, and then investing in getting the infrastructure in the ground and not just leaving it to our localities to do it. But we've got to expand infrastructure to include the care economy, the essential workers who help keep everything else moving, and making sure we are investing in domestic workers and home care workers, making sure that our healthcare system is expanded and that we are reimbursing providers who take Medicaid more than we are doing, so more of them will take Medicaid. Infrastructure is also the government's infrastructure. We have an unemployment compensation commission that is not meeting the needs of Virginians because the computer system that was used was over 20 years old. We didn't have enough people to take in all of the claims that were coming. So we need to broaden what we view as infrastructure. And that's why I'm so excited about the Biden-Harris infrastructure plan, because it takes a comprehensive, holistic view of infrastructure and invests in all of it. And we have to do the same thing at the state level.
Thank you. All right. The next question. Some important bills that are important to communities of color passed the House of Delegates but died in committee in the Senate. As governor, how can you support those bills and help move those bills through the Senate? And I will pass that question to Delegate Jennifer Carroll Foy.
Yeah, so I can tell you that my approach to getting things done, being one of the first women to ever graduate from Virginia Military Institute, I can say that it's taught me that my job is always to get the job done. So not caring if people have a DI or R beside their name is how I try my best to work down in Richmond. However, I will never compromise my values and being effective. And so the way that we have to work is ensuring that we're supporting legislators and candidates running for office who stand for the values that we hold true. So not every person with a D beside their name supports repealing right to work as they should, even because it's a part of our democratic platform. Not every Democrat believes increasing the minimum wage, now, not 5, 6, 7 years from now. And so these are the things that we have to lean on. It's not enough to be a Republican light, right? And so I'm excited to say I had my PAC Virginia for All raise almost $150,000 and gave it away to candidates who truly believe in unions and workers and uplifting women and wages and fighting for jobs and justice. And that's what we have to have going forward. And so I could tell you it's hard work to try to change people's positions. It's even harder to change people's minds. And if we can't agree on our core democratic values, then it's about time that we shake things up and start supporting and getting out there and having more people run for office, and also supporting the good candidates and people who are out there in elected position who's going to uplift all Virginians and not just some.
Thank you. Senator McCollum.
So when I first got elected to the House of Delegates, I was a 32-year-old Black woman from the most Democratic district in the state, operating in a body that was predominantly white Republican men over 50. And I very quickly understood that you have to understand different perspectives, even if you don't agree with them, even if they're not your life experience. Not be afraid to share my perspective and experience, and recognize which perspectives and experiences aren't in the room, and make sure you elevate and center them. So any bill that I have introduced, and I've passed over 330 bills, many in the minority party, over 40 of them since we took the majority, you identify who are all of the people affected by this problem and make sure that they are part of the solution, and you do it before session starts. And many times our governors have waited until the beginning of session to introduce their bills or get engaged in a particular issue. But you have got to do that before session ever starts. If you are waiting until the day session starts, you're going to run out of time. So making sure we identify what are the issues that we need to work on, get everybody in the room, any perspectives that are not in the room, go out into those communities and identify who they are and make sure their voice is being heard. And you keep at it until you get the bill passed. And that is how I've been able to pass as many bills as I have, even when I'm in the minority party, even when I've had to convince some of my Democratic colleagues to come outside of the box and recognize perspectives that they may not have ever thought of.
And I'm so sorry, I have to hop out for another event. And I just want to thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Delegate Hirafoy. And Delegate Carter.
Well, Senator McClellan, it's just the two of us again. This is a very familiar situation for us. So my approach to legislation is to recognize what it is that legislators are afraid of. And ultimately what legislators are afraid of is losing their seats. And so you have folks who are sticks in the mud on issues, but if they fear that they will not come back over that issue, they are much, much more willing to move on it. And so, this has been central to my legislative philosophy, is drilling things down to the essence to make it sort of impossible for legislators to stand in the way without fear of repercussions. And I will continue that as governor. I will make sure that I'm using the bully pulpit of the governor's office to highlight who is the obstacle to progress on issues. It's an approach that hasn't made me a whole lot of friends in Richmond, but it has delivered on a lot of results. Frankly, a lot of results where the Democratic Party has taken my bill and given it to someone else the next year and then passed it, but it got passed. So, this is my approach to legislating. You have to recognize what the pressure points are on those legislators. And if they are obstacles to progress, you have to make sure that their voters know that they are the problem. So I will go out into these districts where we have legislators standing in the way on broadly popular moral issues. And I will not be afraid to say, Hi, I'm the governor of Virginia, and I'm here to tell you that the reason you can't get paid sick leave is because your senator won't support it. The reason that you can't get card check for unionization is because your delegate doesn't support it. It will not be a popular approach within Richmond, but within Richmond, you have less than 200 people making decisions for the 8.5 million of us that have to live with the consequences.
Thank you, Delegate Carter. Next question, kind of circling back to COVID-19, but more so focusing on political participation. The pandemic has also brought to the attention of many the systemic racism that the Asian, Black, and Latino community face, and around the historical barriers of political participation. So knowing that we've had a lot of great legislation that's come out of the General Assembly this year addressing some of that, how will you as governor continue to turn the page definitively on Virginia's history? And so go back to Senator McCall.
Well, voting is an issue that is personal to me. We have all heard since we are kids that we're government by, of, and for the people, but the government only centers and solves the problems of the people who participate. And for too long, many of us weren't allowed to participate, including my own great-grandfather, who had to take a literacy test and find 3 white people to vouch for him to be able to vote. My father and my grandfather had to pay poll taxes. My mother didn't dream of voting until the Voting Rights Act. So to carry the Voting Rights Act of Virginia with Delegate Marcia Price to make Virginia not just the first state in the South to have its own Voting Rights Act, but it's one of the strongest in the country, I will build on that work. I will make sure that all voting locations are accessible, including a language access to those languages that meet certain thresholds in Virginia, that we have ranked choice voting for local and state elections, that we have same-day registration, that we have automatic registration when you make changes at DMV. We have already made a lot of progress going from one of the hardest states to vote to one of the easiest, but we can be #1. And my voting rights plan will make sure we are #1. But we also have to remember that democracy, as John Lewis said, is not a state. It is an action that requires every generation to do its part. Part of that part is making sure that the party is strong and inclusive, which is why I was proud to lead the charge to create an outreach plan for the party and to create a plan for how to organize constituency groups that led to so many constituency groups now being officially recognized by the party. Because I recognize that the party needs to institutionalize community outreach and relational organizing so that candidates don't have to do it every year. And when we do that, every organization, every group gets used to voting every year. It becomes like a muscle. And as governor, I will be head of the party, and I will make sure that the party is doing its part to make sure that all of our constituency groups are aware of, can, and do vote.
Thank you. Delegate Carter.
So the senator is absolutely right that we have in the past had a lot of barriers to voting that we've done a lot of good work on getting rid of. But I think it's important to recognize that not only do we need to make sure everyone can cast a ballot in November and everyone feels comfortable casting a ballot, that everyone feels that they have a good choice to vote for in the election in November. So that's why I am fighting for a fix to our campaign finance system and a fix to our balloting system. So instead of having this first past the post voting system where people feel the need to hold their nose and vote for whomever they hate the least, they can actually vote for a candidate that they're excited for, that represents their own material interests to the fullest, and know that they're not accidentally helping a candidate that they are opposed to win by casting that ballot. But also, we have to recognize that political power springs forward from economic power. And access to that economic power has been incredibly gatekept and racialized within this country and within Virginia in particular, with white folks having much more ready access to capital, to start up businesses, to have ownership over their workplace, ownership over their homes, ownership over their communities. And so this fight to make sure that we have representational politics within our political democracy has to extend to the economic sphere as well. We have to have representation within ownership of business. We have to bring up minority home ownership rates. We have to have more Black and Latino and Asian American farmers and restaurateurs and all industries, factory owners, what have you. And the way that we do that is by building in employee ownership into those sectors of our economy, so that the economic engines that drive not only our lives, but our politics are owned by the people within the community.
Thank you. And the next question is, as you mentioned, Virginia usually has 5 out of the 10 wealthiest counties in the entire country. But this wealth is unevenly distributed, making it increasingly difficult, especially for younger people of color, new Americans and others, to afford housing. As Governor, how will you tackle this growing generational divide as it comes to one piece of the American dream, which is usually around buying a house? And I will go with, I guess I'm just going to Senator McCollum, since we're just going back and forth.
Sure. The bottom line for the affordable housing crisis is that wages have not kept up with the cost of construction and just about everything else. So you have to address wages. We have to get to $15 an hour as quickly as possible. And I will commit to doing that before the end of my term as governor. We have to make sure we continue to remove exemptions to the minimum wage. I was proud to carry the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights that got rid of exemptions for domestic workers and home care workers, but now we need to get rid of the exemption for farm workers. And then we have to make sure we are investing in affordable housing. So that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, we need to invest more robustly in that to meet our needs. We have to make sure that we are, there's a opportunity from COVID, and that we're going to have a lot of vacant commercial real estate. It is cheaper to convert that to residential than to build new. So being more creative about incentivizing that type of affordable housing building, that we are recognizing manufactured housing as one of the affordable options and expanding access to that, removing barriers to local government to investing in and incentivizing affordable housing through density and more affordable housing ordinances that are clearer and easy to use, and then taking away their ability to discriminate on the basis of affordability, which I was proud to carry that bill for years. This year, I let Delegate Jeff Bourne carry the torch, and we got it done, because sometimes it's more important that it get done than who gets credit for it. So again, this is hard to answer in 90 seconds. But that is a big picture what I will focus on as governor.
Thank you. Delegate Carter.
It's very hard to answer this in 90 seconds because the housing decisions that we make as leaders really shape the world that we're living in very, very real ways. The housing policies that we implement determine how far people have to drive to get to work, whether or not they have to drive to get to work, right? And so we have, for far too long, allowed our housing policy decisions to be made by the big banks and the big commercial landlords and property developers. And what we get when we sort of offload that decision-making onto the people that most profit from housing is we get a housing market that maximizes profits for a small handful of already wealthy, mostly white people, rather than a housing market that actually serves the needs of people. That's what housing should be. It should serve that fundamental human need for shelter. So I think that we need to take on the property speculators, and we need to make sure that we have policies like statewide rent control, like good cause eviction laws, so that you can't be evicted from your home unless you've actually done something wrong. We need to have cooperative ownership of multifamily dwellings rather than corporate ownership of those multifamily dwellings. We need to take on exclusionary zoning, right? That's something that when racial covenants and redlining became explicitly illegal. A lot of these speculators found ways to do it with zoning laws that were not illegal, that had the same discriminatory effect. We've got to take that fight on. We've got to make sure that we're bringing down the cost of housing generally, because housing should not be primarily a vehicle for the wealthy to profit. It should be something for the rest of us to live in.
Thank you, Delegate Carter. Final question before we go to audience questions. Given sort of that we've talked about everything from political participation and housing and broadband infrastructure, and with all of these obvious disparities kind of sort of built in for communities of color, what is sort of broadly your overall plan to uplift communities of color that maybe that we haven't already sort of discussed? And what will you do to ensure, that there's always representation at the table and consideration and your plans and policy work moving forward? And I will start with Senator McCollum.
So diversity and inclusion should be more than just one person with 2 staff people at the cabinet level. It should be embedded in every agency of state government that interacts with people, which is just about all of them. It definitely needs to be embedded in our education system, our healthcare system, our commerce and trade and economic focused agencies. It undergirds every policy. I view everything through a lens of equity because I have a deep understanding of our history as a Commonwealth, as a country. As someone whose family lived through the horrors of slavery and Jim Crow and saw in every aspect of our lives how inequity was baked into the system. Everything I look at is through that lens of how do we eradicate that inequity? Because one of the biggest problems I see is yes, racism is a problem, but race ignorance is a problem. And we aren't teaching a true, accurate history of our nation in our schools. As more people were born after Jim Crow legally ended, that's not their life experience. They don't understand how the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow still impacts every community today. And you have to intentionally unwind it. You have to intentionally center diversity and inclusion of all communities in Virginia. And that starts by building a state government that reflects the full diversity of the Commonwealth by every measure, in the cabinet, in our agencies, boards and commissions, and not just focusing on appointing people who contribute to your campaign, but going out into taking the policymaking table out into our communities and working with trusted community leaders from the beginning, not when you're in the middle of a crisis. So again, it's hard to answer that in 90 seconds because it is fundamentally who I am as a Black woman. It is fundamentally who I am as a working mother who sees the intersectionality of just about every issue, and it undergirds everything that I do as a legislator, as a community leader, and as a party leader.
Thank you. And yes, realize the challenge of answering this question in 90 seconds. Delegate Carter.
So as I mentioned earlier, political power, especially in our democracy, really does spring forward from economic power. And so central to my policy goals, central to my platform, is making sure that people have economic power over their own lives. You have very little power over your own life when you go to work every day for someone else and they decide how you work, what you work on, when you work, and how much money you pay. You have very little power over your life if you go home to a home that you don't own and that you're paying someone else to allow you to live in. And so central to my policy in, frankly, all aspects of the future of this Commonwealth is making sure that we are building up ownership of economic drivers within the Black community, within the Hispanic and Latino community, within the Asian American community, within rural communities, within every community in Virginia. Because decisions are being made every single day that impact all of our lives, and they're not just being made within the General Assembly. They're not just being made within local government. They're being made in boardrooms. They're being made by massive corporations. If the primary economic driver in your town is a paper mill and the company that owns it decides to shut it down because they can eke out 3% more profit somewhere else, then the entire economy of your town is going under through no fault of your own. So we've got to make sure that working people from absolutely every community within Virginia have ownership and control over their workplaces and their homes. That is the way that we make sure that decisions that impact all of us are being made by all of us, not by a small handful of wealthy, mostly white men.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, that will close out our official questions portion of the program. So now we will go into questions from the audience. I think some folks put some questions in the chat. If you did, please put them in the Q&A box so I can capture them more accurately. The first question here is, Virginia has the 9th largest undocumented community in the US. In 2020, immigrant rights organizations passed driving privilege cards, which was sort of non-real ID license immigrant rights organizations hope for. The passing of this legislation gives driving access to 270 gay undocumented Virginians. The DMV needs new trusted leadership that the undocumented community can trust. If elected, will you support the passage of non-real ID licenses for undocumented Virginians? Would you be willing to appoint a person of color that immigrant communities can work with as the new DMV commissioner? And Delegate Carter, if you want to go take that question.
Absolutely. I think that, frankly, the fact that we have such disparate treatment between citizens and non-citizens in this country is a shame and frankly, a crime. The Constitution doesn't specify that the rights of the people are reserved for citizens. And we are denying people their civil rights, their human rights, on a massive scale based on their citizenship status. And we should not do that. Now, obviously, as governor, I won't have control over federal immigration policy. What I will have control over is, yes, the non-real ID cards that I will fight to make available, but also whether or not Virginia cooperates with immigration authorities. We have a lot of facilities here in Virginia that we are contracting out to ICE. A prime example being the Shenandoah Valley Regional Detention Center. When news came down in, I believe it was 2018, that some of the children that were being separated from their families at the border were being housed at Shenandoah Valley, I went down there and tried to get in and see exactly what was going on. And as a member of the General Assembly, in fact, at the time I was a member of the committee tasked with regulating jails and prisons, I went down there and I was told, because of the contract with ICE, the only part that I could be shown of that facility was the lobby. I couldn't inspect the conditions inside. I couldn't even verify that there were people being held there on a contract with ICE. So we have got to make sure that Virginia is not helping ICE commit these wide-scale human rights abuses. We have got to make sure that we are not allowing them to use our state and regional and local facilities to deprive people of their rights. And that begins by telling them, you know what, the federal government has control over immigration policy, and we are not going to help you enforce it because that is not our job, and you are not doing it in a way that respects people's rights.
Thank you, Delegate Carter. And Senator McCollum.
Yes, I will push to have a regular driver's license for everyone, regardless of your immigration status. And not only did I support that legislation, if I recall correctly, I co-sponsored the original version by Senator Jennifer Boysko. And frankly, the only reason we agreed to go to the driver privilege card is because by going back to the community directly and asking them, here are your options. We can either wait another year or we can take this now. The community said, we need to drive. We will take this now and we will keep pushing. So that is what I will do as governor, is keep pushing. We need to make sure all government services are provided to all Virginians, regardless of their status. That's why I carried budget amendments to make sure, and we'll work to codify that Medicaid eligibility is not dependent on your status. and we need to make sure that our government services are provided in languages that people understand. So carrying budget amendments that made sure that the Department of Social Services, among other agencies, were investing in real translation services, not using Google Translate. One of my biggest frustrations when we went into this crisis was how many communities were not getting information because they weren't being communicated to in their communities in languages they understand or through trusted community leaders. Our state government was trying to figure out who those community leaders were in the middle of a crisis. I won't wait that long. I've already forged relationships with many, and where I don't have them, I will do that during my transition to ensure that all of our services are meeting all Virginians where they are in languages that they understand, and that are providing services regardless of their status. And I agree that we need to ensure that we are not complicit in ICE, in its making our communities unsafe by making everyone mistrust government services that they in many cases need, but they're afraid the minute they show up, they're going to get deported. We've got to restore the trust and faith between government and all of our communities.
Awesome, thank you. And then the next question is, as governor, what will you actively do to finally have a state employee and appointed workforce that reflects the demographics of the state? For example, Latinos have been underrepresented for decades. 2021, says the question asker. So, Delegate Carter.
So hiring diversity is absolutely one of the ways that we will fight to make sure that we have real economic representation. I think public sector employment historically has been seen as a way for the African-American community to get into the middle class. We've seen typically a lot of government agencies, for example, the Postal Service, hires very heavily from the African-American community. And we've seen that is viewed by a lot of folks as a way to reach a middle-class life. So I think that we need to make that opportunity available to all communities. And I will make sure that our hiring practices reflect the diversity that we have here within the Commonwealth. As far as concrete steps on how we get there, I'm going to be perfectly honest with you. That's something that I don't have a detailed plan on yet. But now that the question has been asked, I'll certainly work on that one.
Okay. Thank you.
So first and foremost, we have got to change how we recruit and advertise vacancies, because just putting it on a website is not enough. Just publishing it in one newspaper of general circulation is not enough. We know that in many Latino communities and many Asian communities, that radio in their native languages, newspapers and publications, that there are community-based organizations where we need to get the information in those communities through the forum that they get information, not put it on a website and say, come look for it. That's with jobs, that's with board and commission appointments. And frankly, we need to build closer relationships with our HBCUs and with organizations within our college campuses, our community colleges, our high schools, our middle schools that are tailored to each specific community. And sometimes it's even as simple as going on career day, sending someone into a community who looks like that community into the school to say, hey, I work for DMV and here's what I do. And when you see somebody who looks like you that does something, you're way more interested in doing it. But too often, state government, we send a press release, we post it on a website, and then we say, okay, why isn't anybody applying? I don't understand. Well, because they can't get the information. So we've got to be more proactive in getting these availabilities into the hands of communities through the way they normally get their information.
Thank you. Next question is a little bit more in the environmental section. Are you in favor of increasing the number of electric school buses, especially in brown and black communities in the Commonwealth? Delegate Carter.
So this has been a hot button issue, particularly within the House Democratic Caucus. Yes, I am supportive of the policy of electrifying school buses throughout the entirety of the Commonwealth. I think that our school bus fleet should be entirely electric as quickly as possible. The big question comes down to how you do that. The proposals that we've seen over the last few years have been basically allowing the electric company to own those school buses, to operate those school buses, and to profit from those school buses. And that is something that I don't support. I think that the process of transitioning from diesel school buses to electric school buses has to be done through public procurement rather than through allowing Dominion to profiteer off of it and having us pay for it through our electric bill.
I think the entire public fleet should be electrified as quickly as possible. Not just school buses, but state vehicles, mass transit. Everything needs to shift away from fossil fuel based to electric. And for any government services, I agree, we have to have a robust procurement process. If we are going to have the electric company involved at all, we need to very clearly and closely regulate how that is done and make sure it is done in a way that is not just passed on to customers. But transportation is the largest contributor to greenhouse gases. If we are not electrifying our fleets, if we are not even as simply as having more efficient bus routes to do everything that we can to reduce carbon gas from our transportation fleets, we're never going to address climate change. And we have to. We are running out. We probably already run out of time, but I'm an eternal optimist. So I think we still have time to get ahead of it. And I will be focused on it like a laser as governor.
Awesome. I have two final questions and then we'll go to your 60-second closing statement. Yes.
If we could go ahead and get the 60-second statements.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. All right, so I will go into 60-second closing statements. So Senator McClellan, why don't you kick us off?
Well, first of all, I just want to thank the caucuses again for doing this. When I was creating the outreach chair and was the first outreach vice chair to implement the outreach plan, this is exactly what we envisioned the purpose of our caucuses to be. And now I'm here asking you to vote for me as governor because we are at a critical crossroads as a Commonwealth, the likes of which we haven't seen since my parents were children during the Depression, where we have an opportunity to decide, are we going to rebuild Virginia in a way that is more equitable, that is stronger and more united, or are we going to go back to where we were a year ago and business as usual? That wasn't good enough. It wasn't good enough for many Virginia communities, and it wasn't good enough for many Virginians. I am often accused of being a boring policy wonk, but policy is my love language. I love Virginia. I love every Virginia community. And I dig in when I see problems and work together with those communities to solve them. And that's why I have led on so many issues. Every issue we've talked about, I've led on and passed legislation on, but we've got so much more work to do. We're going to do it together. And by electing me governor, yes, we will make history. We can make history. But more importantly, we will build a stronger, more united Virginia together. And I'm excited to do that. So I'm here to ask for your vote and I'm here to ask for your support. And you can go to jennifermcclellan.com to sign on to Team McClellan.
All right, Delegate Carter.
Well, thank you so much to the Tri-Caucuses for hosting us here tonight. Central to my campaign is the idea that we have to do things differently in the economic sphere. It's very abundantly clear that the way we have been doing economic development has not worked for millions and millions of Virginians. And the folks that it's worked the worst for are often communities of color. And so we have to fight to make sure that when we rebuild from the COVID-19 crisis, we're doing it in a way that builds economic ownership and control over our own economic destinies within each community in the Commonwealth of Virginia. That's how we will transform this into a place where wealth is common, where everyone knows that they can live and work and not have to worry about how they're going to put food on the table or how they're going to make the rent or whether or not they can afford to see a doctor or put their kids through college or whether they're going to be discriminated against based on who they are, who they love, or who they were born to be. Every single economic crisis that we have faced has represented a massive transfer of wealth and a massive transfer of ownership out of the Black community and out of the Hispanic and Latino community and out of the Asian American community and into the hands of a small handful of millionaire and billionaire investors. The largest single transfer of wealth out of the Black community was the 2008 financial crisis, for example. So we have to make sure that we are doing things differently, that we are building our economy back in a way that is owned and operated by the people who work every day and not by a small handful of people on Wall Street. This is the fundamental imperative, in my view, of our time. The fundamental imperative of this election is making sure that we are building up that economic ownership and control over our own lives within our own communities.
All right, thank you, Senator McClellan and Delegate Carter for joining us this evening and answering our Q&A and our official questions on very important issues concerning Black and other communities of color here in the Commonwealth. I will pass it back to our chair of the Black Caucus, E.J. Scott, for our official closeout.
Thank you so much, Atima, for doing this and being a moderator for us. I truly, truly appreciate your help. And a very, very sincere thank you to the candidates for your participation. Your being here tonight shows that you value our Black, Latino, and Asian communities' contributions to our Commonwealth. This has been an illuminating evening. And thank you to everyone who attended this event tonight. This forum is the second in a series of forums held by the Tri-Caucus, represented by the Democratic Black Caucus, the Latino Caucus, and the Asian Caucus. And I would have to say a special thank you to Jonathan and his team for the great way they kicked off our series with the lieutenant governor's race a couple of weeks ago. Our last forum on the series will be the Tri-Caucus Attorney General Candidate Forum, which will be held on Thursday, May 27th at 7 p.m. So everyone, please keep an eye out for our emails and registration and look on our Facebook page. You know, I have enjoyed you all being here so much. And I have really enjoyed working together with all of our Tri-Caucus members. And this will not be the last Tri-Caucus event. We are dedicated to making sure that our community's voice is heard. So thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your evening.